No one in Chicago ever questioned the name Richard Hale when it was mentioned. People simply lowered their voices, avoided eye contact, quietly nodded as if acknowledging an unwritten rule. Some people do not need to speak to be heard. Richard Hale was that kind of man. For more than 25 years, he had built an empire where everything ran with an almost frightening precision. Contracts never appeared on paper. Decisions were made behind closed doors, rooms where hesitation had no place. Influential figures, lawyers, politicians, contractors, all understood that a single nod from Richard could send their destinies in a completely different direction. He never needed to threaten, never needed to raise his voice. Silence was enough. But there was a truth no one dared to say aloud, a truth that even those closest to him avoided like fire. Richard Hale had never heard a single sound in his 52 years of life. No music at lavish parties, no laughter during the rare moments of privacy, no whispered words from loved ones before they passed away forever. He was born deaf. To the outside world, Richard's silence was a symbol of power, but to him, it was a void that stretched across his entire life, a void he learned to conceal through discipline, control, and absolute emotional coldness. Richard learned to read lips from a very young age, not out of curiosity but out of survival. He understood that if he wanted to exist in a world where people communicated through sound, he had to observe better than anyone else. And he did. Not just better, but so exceptionally well that it was unsettling. He recognized betrayal in the slight tremble at the corner of a mouth, detected lies through eyes that refused to meet his, sensed fear in rapid breathing others never noticed. Richard heard with his eyes, with vibrations beneath his feet, with the subtlest changes in the air of a room. And over time, he began to believe perhaps he did not need sound at all. Perhaps silence was an advantage. Perhaps not hearing the noise of the world had allowed him to see everything more clearly than anyone else. Richard's mansion stood along the shores of Lake Michigan, modern, expansive, and flawless down to the smallest detail. Everything was designed to serve a life without noise. Doors closed softly, thick carpets absorbed movement. Staff moved like shadows. No one spoke unless necessary. No one caused even the slightest disturbance. This was the world Richard had created, a world where silence was respected like law. But silence came at a cost. No one knew how Richard felt when he watched people laugh, unable to hear the sound of their laughter. When he saw music shake a room, he could only sense faint vibrations beneath the floor. When he witnessed moments that should have been the loudest in a lifetime pass by in an invisible hush. He never complained, never cursed fate. He simply accepted it. Until one autumn morning, when everything began like any other day. Richard sat in his office, soft light reflecting through the large glass windows. Financial reports lay neatly arranged on his desk. His world was still under control, solid, predictable, without surprises. And then, a woman stepped into the room, a new housekeeper. No one noticed. No one thought her presence would make a difference. But from that very moment, the silence that had lasted for more than half a century in Richard Hale's life began to crack. The new housekeeper arrived on a morning no one in the mansion could remember the exact time. In this place, time was not measured by clocks, but by routine, and Elena Brooks entered Richard Hale's world in the quietest way possible, without sound, without introduction, without drawing attention. She was about 38 years old, slim, with shoulders that sloped slightly, as if accustomed to carrying weight. Her face was not strikingly beautiful, but it carried the steadiness of someone who had endured more long night shifts than peaceful mornings. Elena's eyes did not wander out of curiosity. They looked straight ahead, yet never intruded, as if she understood her boundaries very clearly. Those before her had always walked carefully in a different way, the way of fear. They lowered their heads too much. They moved too quickly. They were constantly tense, as though a single small mistake could collapse their entire lives. Elena was not like that. She walked slowly, evenly, like someone accustomed to working in rooms where life was more fragile than power. Richard noticed her within the first few minutes, not because he wanted to, but because observation was instinctive to him. In his world, every detail carried meaning, and Elena was a detail that did not quite fit. She did not avoid his gaze, but she did not stare either. When given instructions, remembering, taking notes and memorizing, asking no unnecessary questions. She did not try to make herself invisible, yet she made no effort to stand out. It was a rare kind of presence, present enough to be trusted, but not enough to be threatening. That afternoon, Elena was allowed into the study. This room was the center of all decisions, all secrets, all boundaries that could not be crossed. Other housekeepers always left this area for last, entering with fear visible in every movement. Elena was different. She stood at the doorway a second longer than necessary, as if to take a breath, then stepped inside. Richard sat behind his desk, the light from the glass wall behind him forming a sharp, cold outline around his figure. He pretended to read a report, but every movement Elena made was within his line of sight. She dusted slowly, carefully, missing nothing. She did not touch anything unnecessary. The space itself seemed to adjust, adapting to her rhythm. And then she stopped. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but because she realized something. Elena stood still, the cloth hovering in her hand. Richard sensed the shift immediately. The air in the room subtly sank. When he looked up, her gaze was no longer on the furniture, it was on him. More precisely, on his right ear. That look held no judgment, no curiosity, but a very familiar concern. The concern of someone who had cared for others, who had seen too many things overlooked. Elena stepped closer. One step, then another. Anyone else would have been stopped before getting that far. Richard's hand reflexively moved toward the familiar drawer, but he did not open it, because in that moment, Elena did not resemble a threat. She resembled someone who had noticed a wound that the one carrying it had grown so accustomed to that he no longer recognized the pain. She raised her hand, slowly, as if asking permission. Her lips formed a few words. Richard could not hear them, yet, strangely, he felt them. Not through sound, but through a faint vibration in the air between two strangers. Richard's world had always run on control. Everything had rules. Everyone had a place. But this moment did not exist in any scenario he had ever prepared for. Elena stood close enough for him to see her hand trembling slightly, not because she feared him, but because she understood that what she was about to do could change a life. She hesitated, then stopped. She looked straight into his eyes, an expression asking for permission, not from power, but from one human being to another. And for the first time in many years, Richard Hale did not make a calculation. He nodded, a slight nod, almost unconscious, but it opened the door to a moment no one in that mansion, himself included, could have anticipated. The silence that had lasted for more than half a century was standing at the edge of being broken. The room suddenly felt smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because every space between the two people was slowly closing. Elena stood right beside Richard, close enough that he could see the delicate veins on the back of her hand. Her breathing was steady but slow, like someone preparing to step across a boundary without knowing what awaited on the other side. Elena placed the cleaning cloth down on the desk. The gesture was so light it was almost invisible, but Richard noticed it immediately. In his world, every small change was a signal that something significant was about to happen. She tilted her head, studying him more closely. Not rushed, not impulsive. That gaze did not seek validation from power, but from truth. Elena had seen things others overlooked, subtle details in the human body, the silent signs of long-endured pain. And what she saw at Richard's right ear did not resemble a congenital disability. She raised her hand again. Her fingers stopped just a small distance from his ear, as if one more inch could touch an entire lifetime. Richard felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not fear, but the sensation of standing before something too immense to name. For 52 years, he had learned to accept that some things would never belong to him, to accept that the world always existed on a different frequency, one he could only observe from the outside. And now, in this moment, a woman was placing her hand upon that very boundary, with a gentleness he had never known. Elena touched his ear, not with the cold touch of medicine, not with the haste of previous examinations, but with a careful, respectful touch, as if she understood that what she was doing involved not just the body, but also memory, belief, and an entire life shaped by silence. Richard closed his eyes. He did not know what he was waiting for. Pain, disappointment, or yet another confirmation that hope was a luxury. Instead, he felt something deeply familiar. The dull pressure in his ear, the same sensation that had been there since childhood, so constant that he had come to believe it was simply part of him. Elena focused intensely. She adjusted the angle of her hand, changed the pressure, as patient as someone undoing a knot that had tightened over many years. There was a moment of resistance, as if something did not want to let go. Then suddenly, it shifted. Richard opened his eyes. A strange sensation surged through his head. Not pain, not relief, but change. Like the pressure shift in the ears when a plane descends, only stronger, deeper, carrying a rush of air he had never felt before. And then, it happened. Elena withdrew her hand. In her palm lay a small, dark object, seemingly insignificant. Something far too small to destroy a life, yet it had done exactly that for decades. Richard had no time to look closely before the world rushed in. He heard his own breathing, not the sensation of air moving in and out of his lungs like before, but sound, raw, trembling, unmistakably real. Each breath had rhythm, volume, life. It thundered in his head, both familiar and foreign, making his heart pound so hard he nearly felt dizzy. Then came another sound, the wall clock. For years, he had only sensed its faint vibration through the floor. Now, each tick-tock rang out clearly, steady, unforgiving. Time, at last, had found its voice. Richard sprang to his feet, his hands rising to his head without thought. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Sound poured in from every direction. The soft hum of the air conditioner, fabric brushing against skin, the scrape of a chair moving. Each sound was new, overwhelming, as if someone had been pulled to the surface after a lifetime underwater. Elena stepped back one pace. The sound of her shoes against the stone floor rang out sharply, making Richard flinch. A simple sound, but to him, it was like an alarm bell announcing a completely different life. He opened his mouth, wanted to say something, but did not know where to begin. In the end, only 2 words escaped, hoarse, trembling. Yet they were the first words he had ever heard from himself. "Thank you." Elena broke down in tears, not from joy, but because she understood, within those brief 30 seconds, the silence that had lasted for more than half a century had officially come to an end. The sound did not stop. It did not arrive and then disappear like a strange, fleeting moment. It stayed, clinging to every corner of the room, as if the world had finally reclaimed its right to exist. Richard sat down, then stood up again. His body had not yet adjusted to the new sensations rushing in. Every movement created sound. Every breath left a trace. He heard his own heartbeat. Not the vague pulsing he had once sensed through his chest, but the actual sound, steady, urgent, carrying an unfamiliar rhythm of life. His heart beat as if asking a question he himself did not yet know how to answer. Elena was still standing there, silent, like someone who had just dropped a stone into a calm lake and was now waiting for the ripples to spread. Richard looked at her, then at the small object resting in her palm. Something far too tiny to bear such a heavy charge of guilt. And yet, it had done exactly that. It had kept him outside the world for more than half a century. He took a deep breath. The sound of his own inhalation made him dizzy. Air had a sound, and that sound carried a chill down his spine, a sensation he had never had the chance to experience before. Gratitude came first, real, powerful. It rose like the first light after a long night. Richard stepped closer to Elena, slowly. Each of his footsteps echoed clearly against the stone floor. The sound of shoes touching the ground, the soft brush of fabric against fabric, everything announced his presence in a way he had never known before. "Thank you," he said again. This time his voice was steadier. He could hear the vibration in his own throat, hear the sincerity escaping with the words. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. She did not reply. There are moments when words only make things heavier. Then, very quietly, a thought appeared. At first it was only a small ripple, like metal lightly touching glass. But in Richard's mind it grew louder and clearer. If it were this simple. He looked again at the small object, looked at what Elena had done. No machines, no instruments, no clinic, just observation, patience, and a measure of courage. 3 things he had paid dearly for over the years, yet had never received, despite numerous medical visits. If it was this simple, then why had no one ever done it before? The question did not need sound to be terrifying, but now it had one. The sound of doubt seeping in, eroding the joy that had only just begun to form. Richard felt a cold wave spread through his stomach. Not fear, but realization. Some truths, once heard, do not allow you to return to who you were. He sat down in the chair. It made a soft sound as it took his weight. That sound, small as it was, felt like a heavy punctuation mark. Richard placed both hands on the desk, trying to steady his breathing. Each breath now carried the tone of thoughts growing sharper, colder. Decades. Dozens of doctors, hundreds of examinations. He remembered the sterile, white rooms, the composed faces, the repeated conclusions, incurable, congenital, accepted. And he had accepted it. Not out of weakness, but because he trusted the system, trusted those who were paid to speak the truth. Yet the truth had just been returned to him, in 30 seconds, by a woman with no medical degree, no clinic, no authority. Only eyes that knew how to see, and a heart that knew how to care. Richard closed his eyes. In the darkness, sound continued to exist. The clock is ticking. The air murmurs. The house whispered things he had never heard before. And among those sounds, something else began to speak. Anger. Not explosive, not loud, but slow, solid, like ice forming at the bottom of the ocean. The anger of someone who had just realized he had been robbed, not of money, not of power, but of years of living. Richard opened his eyes. He looked at Elena. She was still there, concern written plainly on her face. In her own way, she understood that the miracle that had just occurred might bring consequences she had never anticipated. "You did nothing wrong," Richard said. His voice was strangely calm, but within that calm, a decision had already been made. He stood up. This time he stood very straight. Sound had returned, and with it, the truth was on its way. 30 seconds had changed 52 years, but what was coming next would change everything he had ever believed. That afternoon, Richard Hale left the mansion earlier than usual. There was no noisy motorcade, no instructions given, only a very different kind of silence, a silence filled with sound inside. When the car door closed, Richard heard the sound of metal striking metal, a dry, precise click. That slight sound made him pause for a single breath. Before, he would never have known it existed. Now, every sound felt like a reminder. The world had always been speaking. He simply had never been allowed to hear it. The car pulled away. Richard leaned back, watching the city slide past behind darkened glass. Chicago in the afternoon was not as quiet as he had once imagined. There were distant car horns. Wind is rushing through the narrow gaps between buildings. Even the vague hum of life itself, chaotic, imperfect, but undeniably real. And amid all those sounds, only one name filled his mind. The doctor who had followed him for more than 20 years. The man who had looked into his ear countless times. The one who had said calmly, "It cannot be treated." Richard was not angry. Not yet. There was no need to rush. Liars often reveal themselves when they believe they are still in control. The clinic was located in the city center, inside a luxurious building where everything was designed to make people feel secure. Richard stepped into the lobby. Immediately, he heard things that had once been nothing more than silent images. Footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The steady hum of air conditioning. The soft rustle of paper from the reception desk. The receptionist looked up as he appeared. Richard noticed the change in her eyes, and for the first time, he heard fear in them. Not through words, but through a breath that quickened slightly. Through the sound of a pen touching the desk and then stopping, as if her hand had suddenly lost its steadiness. He sat down in the familiar chair. It released a faint sigh under his weight. Richard almost laughed. This world, it, had never truly been silent. When the doctor stepped out, Richard heard him before he saw him. Uneven footsteps, slightly hurried breathing. A man was trying to appear calm while his body betrayed him. The handshake was the same as always, but this time Richard heard the faint tremor in the other man's breath. A small detail, but impossible to hide from someone who had just been given back a sense stolen for half a century. Inside the examination room, the lights were cold and bright. Medical instruments lay neatly arranged. Richard sat down, tilting his head out of habit. He did everything as before. But inside, everything was different. When the doctor brought the device closer, Richard heard a tiny sound, minimal, like a sudden intake of breath. A sound people make only when they see something they did not expect. Silence fell. Not Richard's familiar silence, but the heavy silence of someone who had just realized there was nowhere left to hide. The doctor stepped back, set the instrument down. Metal struck the tray with a slightly careless clatter. Richard did not need to look to know the man's hands were shaking. "Your ear is completely clear," the doctor said. His voice tried to remain calm, but a small crack appeared at the end of the sentence. Richard did not respond immediately. He sat still, listening, not only to the words, but to what lay between them. The quicker breathing, the unnecessary pauses, the overly careful choice of words. Then, Richard finally said, his voice low and even, "What have you been seeing for the past 20 years?" The question was not raised, but it carried weight. The doctor began to explain. He spoke of risks, of possible damage, of reasons that sounded perfectly reasonable on paper. But Richard heard the truth elsewhere, in a hesitation before each answer, in the rising heartbeat, in a voice beginning to fracture under pressure. The truth did not come all at once. It was pulled out slowly, like a single thread drawn from fabric woven for far too long. At last, it took shape. Richard's condition had never been untreatable. His silence had been maintained, deliberately. Richard stood up. The faint sound of his suit shifting was enough to make the man opposite him step back half a pace. He did not need to threaten. He did not need to raise his voice. The truth had spoken. And once the truth is heard, no lie is ever loud enough to silence it. The clinic became suffocating, not because of the lights or the air, but because the truth had just been placed between two people like a heavy object, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Richard stood there, upright, his arms relaxed at his sides. He did not need to take another step. Distance was no longer measured in meters, but in the years that had been stolen. The doctor lowered his head. Not quite remorse, more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had carried a secret for too long, until he could no longer tell where the lie ended and habit began. He started to speak, at first disjointed, then faster, as if he knew that once he opened his mouth there was no way back. There had been regular transfers of money. There had been unofficial instructions. There had been moments when he had seen clearly and chosen to look away. Richard listened to everything. He did not interrupt. He did not press. He let each word fall, let each sound find its place in his mind. Strangely, he did not feel the explosion of anger he had expected. What rose within him was something else, deeper, colder. Awakening. For decades he had believed his silence was fate. He had learned to live with it, even to turn it into a weapon. But now he understood that a part of his life had been controlled from behind a curtain, not with guns, not with threats, but with pretense carried out in the name of science. Richard closed his eyes for a second. In that moment, sound still existed, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint vibration of metal in the instrument tray, the steady, deliberate beat of his own heart. He realized something unsettling. Even his anger now had a sound. He opened his eyes, looked straight at the man in front of him. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Richard said, his voice low, neither raised nor softened. "It's not that I was deceived. It's that I learned how to accept it." The doctor trembled, not because of the words, but because of the calm in that voice. The calm of someone who had made a decision long before speaking. Richard turned his back, walked away. Each step echoed clearly in the small room. The sound was not hurried, not angry. It was steady, like the count of time closing an old chapter. He did not need to say anything more. The truth was enough. The rest would be handled in his own way. On his way out of the clinic, Richard paused in the hallway. He heard ordinary sounds, the elevator, voices talking in the distance, the wind tapping lightly against glass. He had lived beside it his entire life without ever knowing, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel regret. Not for power, not for money, but for the smallest moments, the laughter he never heard, the apologies he never recognized, the chances for connection that had slipped away in silence. When he returned to the mansion, dusk had fallen. Richard stepped into the familiar house, but everything felt different now. The house was no longer a fortress of silence. It was a living space, filled with sound, filled with signs of humanity. Elena was still there. She stood near the window, city lights reflecting across her worried face. When she heard his footsteps, she turned. Her eyes met his, as if asking a question she did not dare to voice. Richard looked at her for a long time. In his world, very few people were looked at this way, not with judgment, but with recognition. Elena had no idea what she was getting into when she touched his ear. Yet that very innocence, without calculation, without expectation, had shattered a scheme that had lasted for decades. "You gave me my life back to hear," Richard said. "And there are things that, once heard, can never be pretended to have never existed." Elena did not reply. She only nodded, her hands clasped together. She did not need a reward. She had never sought one. Richard turned away. He knew that from this moment on, everything would change. Relationships, decisions, the people who had stood behind him all these years, unheard. The truth had found its voice, and every voice demands a price. But this time, Richard Hale was ready to pay it, not for revenge, but to live a life that would never be stolen again. Night settled slowly over the city. Lights stretched out like a shimmering river, and for the first time in his life, Richard Hale heard the city breathe. Not loudly, but through its own quiet rhythms. Cars fading into the distance and returning, wind slipping through window frames, the soft clink of metal as the heating system came to life. Each sound was proof that the world had always existed. He had simply never been invited inside. Richard stood alone in his study. He did not turn on the leading lights. He let the glow from the city spill in, soft and real. He placed his hand on the desk, felt the cool surface of the wood, and heard the faint sound of his fingers touching it. A slight sound, but enough to remind him that every movement leaves an echo. Every choice carries consequences. He thought of the years that had passed, of meetings where he had seen only moving lips, of nods, glances, judgments made in silence. He had lived well in that world, very well. But now, with sound added to it, he understood that he had missed an essential part of being human. Not because he was weak, but because there are things that, if never heard, can never be fully understood. Richard remembered the moment Elena stood before him. No power, no fear, only a very human concern. She did not know who he was in the way the world knew him. She only saw someone carrying something that was not right, and she did not turn away. In Richard's life, countless people had seen him, but only one person had seen that he needed help. He stepped out onto the balcony. Cold air brushed against his skin, carrying a soft, rustling sound. He inhaled deeply, heard himself breathe in, breathe out, steady, clear. Each breath was no longer just life, it was a reminder. He was here, truly here. The next morning, everything proceeded as usual. Calls, reports, decisions waiting to be made. But one thing had changed. Richard listened, not only with his ears, but with presence. He heard hesitation in a colleague's voice, heard exhaustion hidden behind professional words, heard even what was left unsaid. His power did not diminish, but it changed, less sharp, less dependent on fear, and strangely, more solid. Richard called Elena into his office, not to reward her, not to question her, only to say something that needed to be said when both were ready to hear it. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I owe you a truth. Some lives are changed not by strength, but by very small courage." Elena remained silent. She nodded. She had never done this for recognition. But there are moments when hearing those words, spoken in an authentic voice, carried by authentic sound, is enough. When Elena left, Richard remained alone. He thought of the people out there, living in different kinds of silence. Some who cannot hear sound, some who are never listened to, some who have grown so accustomed to being overlooked that they forget they deserve to be heard. And he understood one final thing. The most dangerous silence is not the absence of a voice. It is when someone deliberately prevents you from hearing the truth. Richard could not reclaim the 52 years he had lost, but he could decide how to live the years that remained. This time, with all the sound, and with a clear choice. Not to turn away from what is right simply because it comes from a tiny place. The city outside continued to move, and within that flow, Richard Hale, who had lived his entire life in silence. Finally, I learned how to listen to my own life. Some stories do not end when the screen fades to black. They stay, with a slower breath, with a moment when we suddenly listen more carefully to the world around us. Richard Hale understood that better than anyone. After everything, what changed him was not only the ability to hear sound. What changed him was the truth that, for a very long stretch of his life, there had been things existing right in front of him, hidden by mistaken beliefs, by the convenience of explanations labeled unchangeable. He once believed he had adapted, believed silence was his nature, believed that hearing was not necessary to understand. But when sound returned, Richard realized a bitter yet straightforward truth. We can survive in deprivation, but we should never accept it as destiny. Some doors in life are not locked with iron. They are locked with statements repeated so often that we stop questioning them. Impossible. That's just how it is. Accept it. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to look differently, willing to pause a little longer, willing to believe there might still be another possibility, and the entire world behind that door opens. Elena was not a hero. She carried no grand plan. She carried only something scarce, genuine attention toward another human being. She was not searching for a miracle, and because of that, the miracle happened. You might wonder, why does a story about power end with compassion? Because the most incredible power is not the ability to control others, but the ability to return to someone the part of life they have lost. Richard could continue to dominate, he could continue deciding the fate of others, but from that moment on, he understood that what mattered more was not allowing truth to be buried beneath habit and self-interest. And perhaps that is why this story resonates with so many people. Because out there are many other Richards. Not everyone is deaf. However, some have had their voices silenced. Some have been taught that their feelings do not matter. Some have grown so accustomed to silence that they forget they deserve to be heard. If you are one of them, remember this. Change does not always come from great power. Sometimes it comes from a tiny moment when someone truly sees you. And if today you are the one who sees someone else, do not turn away, because you never know. A single, gentle action of yours might become the very first sound in someone else's life. Some mornings do not arrive with significant events. No explosive moments, no history-making decisions, just a very ordinary morning. And for that very reason, it becomes memorable. Richard Hale woke earlier than usual. No alarm clock, no reminders. He opened the window. Cool air flowed into the room, carrying sounds he was only just beginning to distinguish. Early cars rolling down the street, birds beating their wings on the rooftop across the way, wind brushing lightly against the metal railing. Each sound was slight but real, and he stood still, listening, as if afraid that one sudden movement might make it all disappear. He poured himself a cup of coffee. Hot water touched the porcelain mug with a gentle sound. Before, he had only seen the steam rise. Now, he heard the moment itself. A sound so ordinary, so human, that he had never known he was missing for more than half a century. Richard was no longer in a hurry. Not because he had grown weaker, but because he understood this. When we begin to hear the truth, we must also learn to slow down enough to bear it. In the days that followed, he noticed something strange. His power did not disappear, but the way it functioned changed. Meetings still took place, numbers were still read, but he no longer merely watched people speak. He listened. He heard hesitation hidden in phrasing. He heard conviction and avoidance. And sometimes he chose silence, not because he could not hear, but because he heard too clearly. Some people lost their positions. Some deals were halted. No noise, no bloodshed, just a quiet recalibration, much like the way he had once adjusted his entire world when sound did not exist for him. But there was one change no one in the city could see. Richard began to ask more questions, not to control, but to understand. He realized that for many years he had heard information but had never truly heard people. When one lives too long in silence, it becomes easy to confuse knowing with understanding. One afternoon, Richard called Elena into his office again. No official reason, no documents on the desk, only the fading light of day and a quiet room. "Have you ever thought," he asked, "that if you had turned away that day, everything would be different?" Elena considered it for a moment, then she shook her head. "I only did what I believed was right," she said. Her voice was soft, but without hesitation. "If I had turned away, I might have gone on with my life. But I would have known what I had chosen to ignore." Richard nodded. He understood. Some moments never make it into history books, yet they decide how we live with ourselves. After Elena left, Richard remained seated for a long time. He thought about all the times he himself had turned away. Not out of cruelty, but out of convenience, out of habit, out of the belief that some things did not need to be heard clearly. And then he understood the final message life was trying to give him. Not all. Silence is innocent. There is silence that protects us, but there is also silence that imprisons us. Richard did not become a different man overnight. Actual change is rarely loud. It unfolds slowly, quietly, enduringly. But from that moment on, he knew he had made a choice. Not the choice to appear better in the eyes of others, but the choice to stop ignoring what deserved to be heard. The city continued to operate. The world remained noisy, but for Richard Hale, what mattered most was no longer who spoke the loudest, but who was speaking the truth, and who was being forced into silence. And if this story leaves you with anything, perhaps it is not about power or miracles. Perhaps it is a straightforward question. In your own life, what is something you have heard for a long time, but have never truly listened to? Some stories do not need a loud ending. No justice proclaimed under bright lights, no victory raised high like a trophy. They end very quietly, with a person sitting alone with themselves and finally choosing to listen. Richard Hale lived most of his life in silence, but not the peaceful silence of meditation. Instead, an imposed silence. The silence of impossible, of diagnoses that sealed the door to hope, of explanations repeated until no one questioned them anymore. When sound returned, Richard not only heard the world, he heard himself. heard regrets that had never been named, heard anger that had slept for too long, and heard a simple but painful truth. Some years cannot be reclaimed, but some choices are still in time. He did not rewrite the past. No one can. But he chose to change how he stepped into the future. He learned to pause before judging, learned to hear a complete sentence instead of reading only half its meaning, learned to give sound, however small, a place to exist. And on that journey, Richard understood something powerful never teaches. Truth does not need to be shouted to exist. It only needs to be listened to long enough. Elena did not arrive as a hero. She came, worked, noticed, and did not turn away. Sometimes courage is not found in doing something grand, but in refusing to ignore what is right when it appears before us. A small action, light enough to be overlooked, yet real enough to change an entire life. Perhaps that is why this story touches us, not because of a miracle, but because it reminds us we all carry our own forms of silence. Some stay silent out of fear of being judged. Some stay silent because they believe their voice does not matter. Some stay silent because they have grown used to not being heard. But life does not change when we become accustomed to silence. Life changes when we dare to question what has long been considered a given. And if you are watching this story today, perhaps somewhere within you, there is also a sound waiting to be heard. An unanswered question, an emotion pushed aside, a truth you accepted too early. Give it another chance. Because sometimes what we need is not a new answer, but to listen again to an old one with a different heart. It is not the one who speaks the loudest who is right, and it is not what has been silent the longest that disappears. Life is always whispering to us in its own ways. The question is not whether it speaks, but whether we are willing to stop and listen. If this story makes you slow down for a moment, if it makes you think of something you have overlooked, hold on to that feeling. Please share it, talk about it, and most importantly, listen to yourself a little more. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If you find stories like this meaningful, please like, share, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. And if you believe that kindness, truth, and tiny moments can still change people, please subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We will keep telling stories, unhurried, unloud, just deep enough to make you want to listen.